Okay, so I hope everyone are inside the talk and can hear me well. I would appreciate if any one of you can write in the chat that you can hear me well, and I'll now share my screen as well. So yeah, okay, great. So let's start. My name is Or Yair, like you can see here. And today I'm going to show you how I managed to turn EDRs to malicious wipers using zero-day vulnerabilities. I named this research Aikido, and you'll probably soon understand exactly why. So as I mentioned, this is me. I'm a security researcher at SafeBridge. I'm 23 years old, and I've been in the cybersecurity industry for around 5 years now. I've started my way in the IDF, and I've done a lot of Linux and embedded research, along with some Android research as well. And for the last 2 years, I've been experiencing a lot of Windows internals research in SafeBridge, and I really enjoyed so far. But what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to start with talking about the initial research goal that I had in mind when I started this research. Then we'll talk a bit about the general background of wipers, see what they are, how do they work, and what they are used for. Then we'll deep dive into the technical aspects of the research process itself and see how I managed to find zero-day vulnerabilities that enabled me to create the Aikido wiper. So, about the initial research goal. The initial research goal that I had in mind was to create some sort of a next generation wiper. But in order to create a next generation of anything, one first need to understand the current version of that thing. So let's talk a bit about the background of wipers. Now, the first thing that you usually do when you first want to get a general definition of something, because we're talking about the background of wipers, is that you look it up in Wikipedia, of course. And that is exactly what I did. I looked up wiper in Wikipedia, and what I saw is that according to Wikipedia, a wiper is a device used to remove rain, snow, ice, washer fluid, water, or debris from a vehicle's front window. But of course, this is not the wiper that we're going to talk about today, and we are going to talk about the wiper malware. And once I looked up wiper malware in Wikipedia, I saw that in computer security, a wiper is a class of malware intended to erase the hard drive of the computer it infects, maliciously deleting data and programs. Now, I'm sure that this is no surprise for any of you if you are attending this talk, but I just wanted to make this clear. And now let's see what they are used for. So wipers are usually used for some kind of an offensive act, such as in a war. And a good example for a war is the war that we currently see between Russia and Ukraine, for example. I also attached a few examples in which we can see that both Ukraine and Russia were attacked by wipers, and we can see that both Iran and Israel were attacked by wipers. And basically, everything that we hear on the news about rivalry between countries is also expressed in the cyber warfare, a lot with wipers. But let's start talking about the real technical aspects of wipers. the reason that we're all here for this talk. So, at least in my mind, I assume that in your minds too, when you hear the word wipe or wiping, you probably also think about the word deletion. But there is actually a crucial difference between the two. And in order to understand that difference, we can take a look at the default deletion process in the Windows operating system um, to understand that. So in Windows, once a certain process calls the delete file API function, it actually causes the kernel to go to a certain place on the hard drive that is called the MFT, which stands for the master file table in the NTFS file system. And in this table, it just marks a certain entry as free. Now, this entry is just a pointer to the file content. So really, the delete file API function does not delete the content of the file itself, but just the pointer to it. So this is the difference between a deletion and a wipe. When we say that we want to wipe something, it means that we want to delete the content of the file itself as well. And doing that makes the restoration of that content much, much harder, if not impossible. But there is a way to escalate a deletion to a wipe, and this is because MFT entries, freed MFT entries, may be reused again. So that means that once we create a new file after a file was deleted, this file can be potentially given a free MFT entry, the one that was used for the deleted file, and then once some new content is written to the new file, then this content really overwrites the content of the deleted file, which was left on the disk. But when I tried to understand exactly how wipers, how real wipers, how famous wipers overcome this gap between deleting and wiping, I saw that most of them just skip on deleting files and instead they just overwrite them. By overwriting files, they can make sure that they actually delete the actual file content by replacing it with other content. Now, this is something that is done by a lot of famous wipers, some of them also from the very recent years, just like you can see in the bottom of this slide, like Kay Wiper, Isaac Wiper. These are very famous wipers. And of course, this technique also requires admin's privileges if you want to wipe system files, for example, or if you want to delete, to wipe, files that belong to an administrator user, which is usually the case. So it usually will require admin's privilege. Another popular technique by wipers is the drive destruction technique. This technique basically means that the wiper opens the hard drive as a device instead of accessing specific files, and it starts writing directly to it. By writing directly to it, it can overwrite the boot sequence, it can overwrite structures that belong to the NTFS file system, and it can overwrite files themselves. Now, again, this technique is a technique that is used by famous wipers and wipers from the very recent years too. And of course, this technique requires admin's privileges because no unprivileged user should be able to ruin the disk in such a way. And so opening the hard drive for write as a device requires administrator privileges. At this point, after learning about a lot of wipers techniques, I had an insight. If we think about these techniques that I just presented, or any other technique that you can easily find online that is used by wipers, we can see that the API calls and the technique itself is obviously initiated by the process of the wiper. So that means that if, for example, we'll have a process that uses the file override technique on Windows and we'll open process monitor, then we'll see a process that opens and writes to a lot of files. So that's really incriminating. But what if, just what if, we can create some sort of a next generation wiper that could wipe all of these files without using these obvious API calls, which are really framing? And what if also this next generation wiper could do that as an unprivileged user? At this point, what came up to my mind was Aikido. Aikido is a martial art that specializes in using the power of the opponents against them. But how is that relevant to wipers, you ask? It's relevant because EDRs are the opponents of wipers, and EDRs have a very strong special superpower. EDRs can delete any file they want on the system, no matter the required privileges, because they run in the highest trust level with the highest permissions. They must have this ability because potentially any file on the system can be malicious. I just want to make sure that everything works fine and you are all following. Okay, great. So, but before we are going to understand exactly how we can Aikido the EDRs into deleting our target files as a wiper, we first need to understand how and when EDRs delete files or quarantine them. So it usually depends on the configuration, of course. But the most default configuration that I saw on EDRs is that they do choose to automatically delete files that they identify as malicious for sure. And some of them detect these files when they are open. Some of them detect these files, these malicious files, when they are closed after they were written to. Some detect them when they are executed. Some do all, and almost all of them offer a custom option for a custom option for a scan in a custom tab. And now that we know how and when they choose to delete these files, at this point I had another minor insight. And the insight was that even as an unprivileged user, I still have a certain amount of control over this very powerful entity, which is the EDR. And that is because even as an unprivileged user, I can trigger a deletion, because an unprivileged user can create a malicious file. And by creating a malicious file, a deletion is triggered. So all that we are really left with, all that the unprivileged user is really left with, is that it needs to trigger the deletion for the wrong file, but it can already trigger it. So, of course, the first idea that comes to mind is that these next generation unprivileged wipers should maybe just add some malicious content to an innocent file and then wait for the EDR to delete it. But there are two obvious problems with this method, with this idea, and they are that Of course, doing that requires write permissions to the target file, and we want to run as an unprivileged user. And doing that really looks like calling the same API calls that are used in the file override technique, if we'll do that for a lot of files. So I quickly gave up on that idea and came up with the second one. And the second one was that I should maybe somehow point the EDR or the antivirus towards a different path to delete, while it still thinks that it deletes the original path that it intended to. Now, these vulnerabilities, these confusions, are usually achieved using links. And the link vulnerabilities category is very well known in the cybersecurity industry. There are so many fixed link vulnerabilities, so many that Microsoft has realized that they must have a special user right that is called the create symbolic links user right. And it's given by default only to administrators. But the weird and strange thing is that in the NTFS file system, there is another type of link that is called junction points. Now, junction points are like a hard link for a directory. But the strange thing is that a creation of a junction point does not require any special permission whatsoever. So an unprivileged user can create a junction point that points to wherever it wants to. And if we'll take a look, if we'll look from a high-level point of view on the differences between a local directory symlink or a junction point, then there is no really a difference. They work exactly the same. So I knew that if I want to somehow confuse the EDR and Aikido the EDR into deleting a different path as an unprivileged user, I should probably use junction points. But even knowing that I'm going to use junction points, I still needed to know exactly how and when. And at this point, I think it's important to understand and be familiar with two crucial events in the deletion process of the file by the EDR. In the deletion process, we have the first event in which the EDR detects the malicious file, and then we have the second event in which the EDR really deletes the file. But between these two events, there is a potential gap that I myself identify as opportunity to maybe use junction points to point the EDR towards a different path while it still thinks that it deletes the original path. These kind of vulnerabilities are usually classified as TOCTO vulnerabilities, which stands for time of check and time of use. But in this case, something more suitable will probably be time of check and time of deletion. Now, I have an example here for how this this confusion can potentially be done using junctions. And this was just the original idea at that point in time. So let's take a look to understand. Let's say that an unprivileged user wants to delete the ndis.sys file that we see on the left. The ndis.sys file is a driver in Windows, and it is contained inside the directory C Windows System32 drivers. So what the unprivileged user needs to do is that it needs to create a path which is very similar to the target path, just with one main difference, which is that it it's all contained inside this directory, the temp directory, which is controlled by the unprivileged user, as well as everything inside it. And then the unprivileged user needs to somehow make a privileged program to try and delete this new file that it created. So in our case, it would be that the unprivileged user creates a malicious file, for example, that the EDR, which is a privileged program, wants to delete. Now, right before the privileged program, in our case, the EDR, tries to delete this new file that the unprivileged user created, if the unprivileged user deletes everything from inside the temp directory and converts it to be a junction point that points towards the C drive, then the same path that the EDR tries to delete, which is C temp, Windows System 32 drivers, and this.sys, really points the EDR towards the original and this.sys file without the temp directory. So this is exactly what I try to do. I try to create Mimikatz, which is a malicious file that the EDR wants to delete, in the path ctemp Windows System 32 drivers and this.sys, while and this.sys is the Mimikatz file. Then right after the creation of the file, I tried to delete everything from the temp directory with the temp directory itself, and instead create the ctemp junction point that points towards the C drive. But these attempts were not very successful, and I saw two primary behaviors by the EDRs. The first behavior by some EDRs was that they just identified, once I deleted the temp directory with the Mimikatz file inside, they identified that there is no longer a threat and there is no longer a need to delete the malicious file because it's gone. The second behavior was that some EDRs just had a very, very good grip on the Mimikatz file that I created, and so I was not able to delete it, and I was not also able to delete the temp directory and create the junction instead. At this stage, I understood that I should probably somehow expand this window of opportunity that I have between the time in which the file is being detected and the time in which the file is being deleted. And in order to do that, I thought of maybe using handle catching. Now, in Windows, we have the create file API function. The create file API function is the function to create or open files with. This function requires one parameter that is called the file sharing mode. Using the file sharing mode, we can define whether other processes on the system should be able to write, delete, or read the file that we're currently opening or creating. Now, the policy that is given to the file sharing mode is enforced as long as the opening or creating process of the file holds an open handle to that file. So what I try to do is that I try to create the malicious file, the decoy file, we can call it, the Mimikatz file, with a file sharing mode of read only. So the EDRs are able to read the file and identify that it is malicious, but they are not able to change it or delete it. Then I also held the handle to it open, so they are not able to delete it. At this point, the EDR started to pop up messages that tell me, hey buddy, we need you to reboot your computer because we can't delete the this threat. They knew that if they reboot the computer, then the handle will probably be closed. So let's see how this feature works. The two primary methods that I saw EDRs using for implementing um, for postponing the deletion of the file to after the next reboot are first using the default Windows API for that. And in EDR that use that API, for example, is Sentinel-1. And the other way was just to implement it inside the EDR, meaning to keep a list somewhere of the files to delete after the reboot. And then after the reboot, just go through the list and delete these files. And an example for an EDR or an antivirus that does it is Windows Defender. But let's take a closer look at the Windows API for achieving that, for postponing a file deletion to after the next reboot. It is done using a function that is called moveFileEx with a flag that is called moveFileDelay until reboot. Passing this flag to the moveFileEx function requires administrator privileges, and it requires that because once this function, the moveFileEx function, receives this flag, it actually goes to a certain registry value that is called pending file rename operations, and to that value, it just adds an entry in here that is the path to delete after the reboot. But the ridiculous thing about EDRs and antiviruses using this feature to postpone file deletion to after the next reboot is that this feature blindly follows junctions, and junctions can be created as an unprivileged user, I remind you. And some self-implementations by EDR do that too. So overall, this has led me to create one complete process that combines the first technique that we talked about with creating the junction and catching the handles together in order to be able to delete almost any file or directory that I want on the system as an unprivileged user. So let's take a look at the previous example with the undetectable file in order to understand how that works. So the process starts with creating a malicious file in the path ctemp Windows System 32 drivers undetectable, then hold the handle to that very same malicious file that was created with read-only file sharing mode and force the antivirus or the EDR to postpone the deletion to after the next reboot. Then delete the ctemp directory with the mimikatz file inside and instead create a ctemp junction that points towards the C drive. Then reboot the computer and the undis file will be gone. By doing that, we've achieved our two what-ifs from the beginning of this talk, and I really hope that any other edge case that you have coming up in your mind right now will be answered in the rest of the talk. So overall, this has led me to find 4 different zero-day vulnerabilities in 6 different vulnerable products. The products are Microsoft Defender, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, Sentinel-1 EDR, Trend Micro Apex 1, Avast Antivirus, and AVG Antivirus. If we look to the right of this slide, we can see Gartner's graph for the endpoint protection platforms in 2021, and we can see that 3 out of the 5 vendors that I just listed are high up on the leader square, so that's huge. Overall, I received 3 CVEs by Microsoft, Trend Micro, and Gen, which is the mutual vendor of Avast and AVG. Apparently, Windows Defender and Defender for Endpoint share the same vulnerable code, so that's the reason for the single CVE by Microsoft, and apparently Avast and AVG also share the same vulnerable code. So this is the reason for the single CVE as well. They all fix the vulnerabilities, but I was not granted the CVE from Sentinel-1 yet. I should mention a little disclaimer regarding the vulnerabilities in the Defender products. And the disclaimer is that I was only able to delete whatever directory that I want on the computer and not also any file that I want. But as you know, a wiper does not really care about deleting a few extra files on the way. So if the wiper wants to delete a certain file, it will just delete its directory. So that was not a major issue for the Aikido wiper. Now I have the first demo in this presentation with the exploitation of the vulnerability in the Windows Defender products without the actual wiper in play yet, but let's see how the exploit works. In this demo, we'll see the exploit attempting to delete drivers as an unprivileged user. So here I'm showing the drivers directory. We can see that all the drivers are inside, a lot of drivers. Now we can see that I'm running as a user called limited, and limited belongs to the unprivileged users group. Now I'm creating the path temp Windows System 32. And inside this path, I'm creating a malicious file called drivers, just like the drivers directory. I'm holding the handle to it open and asking Defender to scan that path just to rush the process. Now I'm asking Defender to remove this path just to rush the process again. Defender tries and sees that it can't, and it asks for a reboot. Now it's safe to close the handle to the malicious file, delete the temp directory, create a junction instead with the same name in the same path, reboot the computer, and let's see what happens. So we can see that most of the drivers from the drivers directory are gone because Windows Defender iterated through all the drivers until it encountered one that was open or something like that that interfered in the deletion. So it was not able to delete it and it stopped, but it deleted most of the drivers, and the operating system after the next reboot is no longer bootable. This exploit is effective also against a ransomware protection feature by Microsoft that is called the controlled folder access. And this feature basically prevents untrusted processes from modifying or deleting any file that is contained inside one of the folders that are listed in the protected folders list. But the thing is that Windows Defender or any other EDR or antivirus are the most trusted entity on the system. So this feature is not going to prevent these entities from deleting any file on the system. Overall, I tested 11 different products and 6 of them were found to be vulnerable. That is more than 50% of the tested products. And not only that, I was just unable to force the other products to postpone the deletion to after the next reboot. So if you find a way to do that in these products or any other product, my guess is that they will be vulnerable too. So I really encourage you to try and find these vulnerabilities before real attackers do. And now to the actual Aikido wiper tool. So I implemented it for Sentinel-1, Defender, and Defender for Endpoint just because they were the easiest to implement and most consistent with the exploit. The wiper is able to make the system fully unbootable, just like we saw in the demo. It is able to delete system files. The wiper is fully undetectable because it deletes files using the most trusted entity on the system, in our case, the EDR or the antivirus. And the EDR or the antivirus are not going to prevent themselves from deleting any file on the system. Lastly, the wiper also minimizes the noise of the creation of a malicious file with the creation of an ACAR file instead of a real malicious file. The wiper runs with the permissions of an unprivileged user, again, like we saw in the demo and we'll also see in the next demo. The wiper is able to delete important files that belong to an administrator. And in the second demo, we'll see the wiper in an attempt to delete a whole administrator directory with all of its content inside. But if you remember in the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that there is a crucial difference between a deletion and a wipe. So I still needed to overcome this gap somehow, but this was actually pretty simple. All I really needed to do is to, after the reboot, after the files are deleted, to fill the free space on the disk for a few times with random bytes in order to make sure that any content which was left on the free space on the disk is overridden by random bytes. And I also verified with two popular tools that I found online, Clever Files Disk Drill and CCleaner Recuva. I verified that they were able to recover certain files before I implemented this feature, but after I added this feature to the wiper, they were not able to recover any file, any lost file. I'm also sure that you asked yourselves about the quarantine directory. What if the default configuration of the EDR is to quarantine the files and not delete them? So this, the solution to this was also quite simple. All I needed to do is to exploit the vulnerabilities. So the EDRs mark their own quarantine directory for deletion as well, and they could not quarantine the quarantine directory, so the quarantine directory was deleted too. I documented everything that I could in the repository, all the function. I tried to make it as clear as possible. I also invested a bit in the code design, so it is expandable as much as I could. So I really encourage you to go inside the repository, clone it, download it, fork it, learn from it, and find more vulnerabilities before real attackers do. Once the session is done, I'll also paste the link in the chat. So I'll give you another moment to scan the QR code or take a picture or something. So let's move on. You can also just look up Aikido Wiper GitHub on Google. And now to the second demo that I promised you, with the wiper itself in action against the Sentinel-1 EDR with the attempt of deleting a whole administrator user folder. So let's take a look. Here I'm logged in as the administrator. At first, we can see in all the default libraries that there are a lot of files. We can see that this is really the admin, and this admin belongs to the administrator group. Then I'm switching to the limited user. And we can see that this is, again, the limited user. And this user belongs to the unprivileged users group. We can see the wiper. I'm running the wiper. I'm telling it to do proxy deletion of all user data of the user admin. We can see here in the users directory, the admin folder, which contains all the files that we saw earlier. The wiper automatically realizes what the EDR on the computer is, exploits the right vulnerability, marks the admin directory and the quarantine directory for deletion with the exploit, and let's see what happens after the reboot. So the admin directory is gone. And we can also see that the free space on the disk is starting to fill up with random bytes in order to make sure that the content is really wiped. And we can see that the wiper, just a sec, the wiper was ran automatically, silently after the reboot. So to sum it all up, what did we learn today? So a wiper or any other malicious executable is much more dangerous if it uses a trusted entity on the system, in our case an EDR or an antivirus, to do its malicious actions. Now, for the 1,000th times, having security controls does not mean that you are actually secure. So please keep verifying and validating every day that you are actually secure. And lastly, security controls also might be a very preferred target for an attackers because they have very high trust level and very high permissions. Now, I do have some vendor responses, but they are quite long, so I won't read them to you. But overall, I can say that they were pretty cooperative and I had no issues. They all fixed the vulnerabilities. These are the versions that you need to update to. I did not receive the number of the fixed version from Sentinel-1, but I do understand that they fixed it. I reported back in July or August. These are the versions. In Trend Micro, it's a patch and not a version. I also want to thank Shmuel Cohen, which is a team member of mine, for the assistance with testing different EDR and antivirus products against my exploits. And this is pretty much it. We're done. Let's see if we have some time for Q&A. Okay. So if you have some questions, you can go ahead and ask them now. You also have my contact details in here. You can see my Twitter, LinkedIn, and email. You can also, you're welcome to talk with me later. So
looks like everything was clear, Ur.
Okay.
No questions. So thank you for this really interesting but also quite scary presentation. We are, of course, really grateful.
We have one question.
Sorry.
Time? Yeah, okay. So, Christian, do we know if there is similar approach that is viable on other platforms? Not sure, but as a security researcher, I think that it's a very good question to ask yourself when you're researching something. What is the superpower of the opponent of what I'm trying to do, and think about how you can abuse it. I think this is a very important thing that I learned from this research. So if that is it, yeah, GM, we can finalize.
What I was trying to say is that we are really grateful that you found this vulnerability, so they got fixed in this quite common endpoint protection software that probably many of us use every day.
Yeah.
So that concludes this session. Thank you very much, Ur, and thank you for watching.
Thank you, everyone.